The next video is the next instalment for riding the Thunderbolt, and we're up to Saturday, December 31st. We saw the birds first, pelicans sliding across the blue sky, wedge-tailed eagles skating above them, snake birds, cormorants, cruising between them, and then a blur of smaller birds. We couldn't see Narran Lake for a long time. We were just trotting across that flat plain as trees began to appear. Then we finally saw the lake. For a moment we thought it was a mirage through the trees, like when a fold of ground catches a piece of the blue sky. But we could hear the birds splashing, and then we saw the ripples. We stopped at the edge of the trees. "Big, isn't it?" Tomo said. There was a low bank at the edge of the lake. Before us there was nothing but birds and an endless stretch of water. It was as if all that great flood had gathered here. I could swim to Sydney, to London, in that water. "How do we find the cattle duffer here?" I said. "Dunno," said Tomo. But that was sorted out less than 10 minutes later. We were moving toward a clump of coolabahs when we heard hoofs thundering beyond them. A dusty roo burst from the coolabahs, saw us and veered for the lake. A moment later a woman with long black hair galloped from the trees to chase the roo. All she had was a funny spear, and she didn't throw it. Instead she rode down that roo like she was a drover after a cow. The roo splashed into the lake, and she charged after it, hurling muddy sheets of water and thousands of shrieking birds into the air. For a moment she disappeared behind the flapping confusion. Then we saw her flashing the end of her spear against the roo's leg. The roo tumbled into the water. She reined her horse, slithered down, and ran through the shallows to the thrashing roo, shortening her spear. It flashed once more, and then the roo was still. But then she saw us. She leapt back on her horse and trotted out of the water toward us, holding her spear at the ready. But as she approached, we saw it wasn't a real spear. It was worse. On the end of a long-shaven sapling there was a sharpened shearing blade, and it was dripping blood. The woman nudged her horse closer, and I really started thinking of bolting, as if I could with Buttercup. The woman was only short, maybe 5 foot, but with her rough man's shirt and trousers and her tossed black hair she looked tough. And then there was a touch of duskiness in her face. With that spear she could have been a black from the open deserts. But then she said, "What do you want?" And suddenly she sounded like a proper lady from Sydney. Tomo started gabbling. Maybe to help keep his head on his shoulders. "We want to join the bush." "You mean Fred," the woman said. "He's not around right now. You can bring the carcass." Tomo snapped his fingers at me and I went to the roo. A heavy roo. Nothing changes. I had to kneel in the water to pull it over my shoulders and staggered to my feet like Uncle Pratt coming home from the inn. I had trouble with Buttercup and I tried to load the carcass onto her back. She sniffed at it and shied away until I said some mean words to her. Then she tolerated me shoving the roo's short paws over her neck and hauling at them from the other side. After that, it was almost easy. The woman, she said her name was Marianne Maud, led us around the edge of the lake for half a mile to her camp. The camp was in the middle of a stand of coolabahs, very close to thick reeds on the edge of the lake. It looked like she had been using it for months, with paths crisscrossed, a pile of ash and a stack of dry wood. There were 2 little children there. The oldest, Mariner, Emily, maybe 3, was looking after the fire, while Elizabeth Ann, a baby, was asleep on a cut-down brown blanket in the shade of a spreading coolabah. They didn't have a tent, but Marianne had built a lean-to of branches and leaves against a big tree. Beside the lean-to were 2 large cane baskets, a double-barreled gun, bullets, a bag of gunpowder, and a few hides, as well as tea, sugar, tobacco, and some yams. We helped Marianne prepare the carcass, skinning it, chopping off the head and tail, cutting up the meat. My job, of course, was to get rid of the guts. Marina showed me a hole away from the camp, and I buried them there. Finally, Marianne got a stew going in a huge pot, and she began to talk a little bit. And yes, she had been to a Sydney private school. She could sew, sing, do arithmetic, and read and write. After school, she had been a helper in a bakery and then worked as a domestic. "This life is better," she said, "but I miss the reading." Tomo kept looking from her terrible weapon to her face and back again until she laughed at him. She said that her mother had been in a tribe near Gloucester and had become very friendly with the top shepherd, James Bugg. The men in the tribe were so annoyed that they planned to kill Bugg one night, but she rushed to warn him. Bugg said if she's good enough to save a man's life, she's good enough to be a man's wife. So she left her people, took a new name, Elizabeth, got married and had Marianne and some other children. Marianne patted the snoring baby. "Baby Elizabeth has my mother's name to remind me of her. I think I'm like her. And that ends that installment for Riding with Thunderbolt.